Hey everyone, back again. Today I'm starting a 3-part series on Noura Erakat's Justice for Some, Law, and the Question of Palestine. Because, this text gives such a good overview of the history of Israel's treatment of Palestine and Palestinians through a legal perspective. That's Erakat's training. I should say Erakat the Brilliant. From now on, I'll try to remember. I will refer to Erakat as Erakat the Brilliant. Through a legal perspective, but also a historical one, also a sociocultural one. It's brilliant. Politically, it's brilliant in so many ways. This is the kind of book I dream of writing something 100th as good as something like this one day. And that would be a major accomplishment for me. And so this book, I have taken so much time to try to capture the entirety of this book, and I'm going to try to convey it to you as best as I can, but I cannot do justice to this. I really recommend you purchase this book, you read it, you follow Noura Erakat in all of the work she is doing to try and end Israel's slaughter of Palestinians, which must end now. It should have ended months ago, and it must never happen again, which means holding Israel accountable for its repeated crimes against the Palestinians that the UN has now branded an extermination, and they must be held accountable for this, because this has to end now. Now, if you want to help in any other ways, I haven't really given any ways so far, consider contributing to some of the organizations I've listed below. Even if your money can go to save just one Palestinian, it is worth it. Please consider doing it. Please consider sharing Palestinian voices, Palestinian legal scholars, Palestinian political and poetic figures, because part of the project here is not only in opposing Israel's relentless slaughter of Palestinians, it is also about amplifying Palestinian culture and identity in the face of its systematic erasure by the Israeli authorities, military, and in many ways, its entire cultural apparatus. So as I said, this is going to be divided into 3 parts. The first part is going to cover the preface, the introduction, and chapter 1. The second part is going to cover chapters 3 and 4, and the final episode, the final part, is going to cover chapters 4 and 5. So let's jump into the preface here. Let's just jump into it. This book just simply, it looks at the failure of international law, specifically laws pertaining to occupation laws that have been internationally recognized, to account for Israel's occupation of Palestine. So really there's a simple thesis throughout the core of this book that Erakat the Brilliant gives us, and that is that law is almost no good on its own. Law is only as good as the political apparatuses in place to enact what the law essentially demands or prescribes. This is why the UN and the International Court have zero power in the face of the world's hegemonic powers like the US and Israel, because as the UN and the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and the International Criminal Court have repeatedly shown, these countries have committed so many war crimes, yet will never be held accountable for it because there is no apparatus to hold them accountable. Who and what should be put into place to make sure that the world's most violent, oppressive regimes can be held accountable? And that is what Erakat, the Brilliant, is asking of us, encouraging us to begin talking about and seeking to put into place. And this has been long in the making. It wasn't just Erakat the Brilliant who brought this up. Many states, specifically states that were once colonized or occupied, have been pushing for this for decades, since after World War II. Thinking here Algeria, thinking here South Africa, and other states. So here she's going to be looking at the way that Israel's influence of the language of law and really influence over law itself, permits Israel to kill with little resistance and generally with impunity from the international courts in its slaughter of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and to justify its relentless occupation and expansion into the West Bank and Gaza, and that it has been doing for decades, that the UN has repeatedly condemned as being illegal, and that the US has historically been like, don't do that, Israel. Then Israel does it, and the US doesn't do anything to stop it, because of course they tacitly encourage it. So the UN has failed to actually discipline Israel for its illegal settlements, for its slaughter of Palestinians. It has failed to bring meaningful change in the region, and the Oslo peace process, which, don't worry, we're going to get into. Like, we are going to start from before Israel even existed, because remember, it only existed in the late 40s. We are going to go from then all the way to the present, or at least till about 2020 that this book covers. And we're going to get into all the details of all the historical moments in that period, which is extremely important to know. But the other thing, before I interrupted myself, is how the Oslo peace process essentially stifled the possibility of a two-state solution, which is not what Erakat the Brilliant is arguing for here. She is not advocating for a two-state solution, nor for that matter one state one, and that's not because she doesn't agree with it, not because she doesn't agree that Israel should be a secular state, that Palestinians should have the right to vote in, which, as it claims to be this amazing democracy in the Middle East, should be permitted. If it is truly a democracy, every single Palestinian who is being occupied by Israel should have the right to vote and to vote out all of the people currently in Israeli government. That is how a democracy is supposed to work, at least as far as I'm told. At least as far as the US loves to claim democracy is about, until it goes against its interests. So the book is essentially a call to action of lawyers to leverage their skills against the culture of apathy that has gripped the world in its approach to the Palestinian question, to Israel's violence against Palestinians. And that puts us here into the introduction. So in 2016, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 2334 that unequivocally condemned Israel's illegal settlements in the West Bank. So for those of you that don't know, the United Nations Security Council is comprised of China, France, Russia, US, and the UK, and then there are 10 other countries that in most cases are what are called middle powers, so countries that aren't the part of the global hegemon, but are more like middle powers, that rotate and that occupy 2-year cycles on the United Nations Security Council. So there are 15 states on it at any given time, right? With China, France, Russia, US, and the UK always on it, and 10 other states rotating on a 2-year cycle. So Resolution 2334 unequivocally condemned Israel's illegal settlements. In the vote on this resolution, the United States abstained, which is often the United States has historically done this for anything that opposes Israel in any way. That is as far as they have historically gone. They would abstain from a vote, which pretty much signals to the world that whatever they're voting on is the just and correct thing. It is the morally right thing, but of course, the US's affiliation and allyship with Israel does not permit it to actually act upon its condemnation, which it has historically actually condemned Israel quite a few times, not like condemned in like the official sense, but has criticized Israel. Now, the US has a long history of shielding Israel. Between 1972 and 2017, the US vetoed censures of Israel 43 times. 43 times. And this is across both political parties. This isn't a partisan issue. This is bipartisan within the US, and it is also bipartisan within Israel. anyone who says that the ongoing slaughter of Palestinians is somehow due to the right-wing government currently in place in Israel under Netanyahu is deluded. They're deluded. This has been going on for almost a century now within Israel as a state. And it has been the mandate of both left and right-wing governments, as I will show, and the same in the United States. In fact, left-wing governments in the US have actually kind of historically been worse, if you include Joe Biden, who has been the absolute worst in his apathy toward Palestinian suffering. There is no comparison to be made to any other president. And we're going to get into all of that. We're going to cover all of that, so just sit tight. I know I'm being a little bit more animated. Maybe I'm screaming a little bit more, a little louder than normal. I hope that that's not off-putting. But sit back, try and relax, and take in this history. So with Resolution 2334 that condemned Israel's illegal settlements that the U.S. abstained from, even in the face of that abstention? Abstination, whatever. Israel lost its mind. Israel just blew its lid in response, crying that this would threaten the peace in the region. Now, don't be fooled, though. A few weeks before it passed, the U.S. increased its annual spending in Israel from $3 to $3.8 billion a year. A year of taxpayer money. While the U.S. also loves to cry about how there's no money for healthcare, or for schools, or to pay teachers, or to pay other public servants. No. But there's infinite money to fund wars overseas. There's always infinite money for that. And there are so many instances of the U.S. backstabbing Palestinians and just siding with Israel. In 2012, of course, the U.S. opposed a Palestinian bid for statehood, including so many other historical instances of the United States treating Palestinians as subhuman, as being undeserving of rights, as being undeserving of representation. Now, did Resolution 2334 do anything? The condemnation of Israel's illegal settlements? Not really. Israel claimed it was an attack on them, which they often do. So often, if there is any move by the United Nations or any other international body to recognize Palestinians, Israel cries about how this is somehow an attack against them. It's one of their common strategies. Perhaps, in some cases, they go so far as to claim that it's anti-Semitic. They will do anything that they can to make sure that Palestinians are not given the rights that they deserve as humans. And this is a common story. Israel does horrible things, they get condemned, and then they keep doing those things because nobody is able to hold them accountable. And this book explores how law is influenced by power and by politics to benefit Israel at Palestinian people's expense and the Palestinian territory's expense, where Erakat the Brilliant wants to reveal how international law has essentially been co-opted for the world's superpowers in the West, mostly. So what is international law really? It's kind of an important thing. You gotta know about international law. It emerged largely to represent colonial states, actually, hence its attachment to Israel. It has historically, think of the people who occupy it, the countries that occupy it, with on the United States Security Council and that are represented in the UN. These are primarily colonial languages represented in the United Nations, where there's 6 represented languages of the hundreds of thousands of languages. Hundreds of thousands. How many languages are there on Earth? 1,000? Let's just say hundreds. I'm going to say hundreds. Hopefully somebody Google it and tell me, whatever. The hundreds and hundreds of languages across the world. 6 are represented in the United Nations. These are primarily languages of previous colonizers. And international law emerged largely to defend colonizers from the colonized mounting armed resistance against their colonizers. It was used to lend conquest a veneer of legality, in Erakat the Brilliant's words. This isn't to say that these laws only serve power, though. There have been moments when it's done good things for oppressed people. But historically, it has primarily served power's interests. One prime example is the U.S.'s appeal to international law to justify Guantanamo Bay, to justify their capture, detainment, incarceration, and torture of people that they suspect of terrorism without any chance of them seeing a day in court, which Israel loves to do as well. You can just look this up. You can look up how many Palestinians are currently and have historically been held in Israel, many of whom are children, 1,000 or so, children who will never see a courtroom, which breaches international law. Are these hostages? I don't think it's far-fetched to think so. But we'll get into this in a lot more detail. But the creation of the concept of the terrorist has been used as a way to bypass law, to bypass established law, to say that this situation is what is called sui generis, if I'm pronouncing that right, which means or translates to a unique situation, which is something the US and Israel love to use to say that traditional law, like occupation law or the law of prisoners of war or anything like that, doesn't apply because this situation is totally new. We're dealing with a totally new enemy, the terrorist, quote-unquote terrorist, who can't be explained with traditional methods. So therefore, the US, Israel, and other nations are able to defend their reprehensible treatment and violence against these people that they deem to be terrorists. But again, international law has not only been in the service of power. There are so many cases of NGOs using international law or leveraging it for the benefit of the oppressed, as we will also see the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, under the leadership of Yasser Arafat. We're going to get into all of that. Made heavy use of international law and made great strides. Also made great mistakes with international law to earn international recognition, for Palestinians to earn international recognition. So powerful states, though, right? They lose their minds when people they oppress use their institutions against them, like the ICC, the International Court of Justice, or the International Criminal Court, or the International Court of Justice, which is what we see right now, where it has issued arrest warrants for the leader of Hamas and the leader of Israel, Netanyahu, to which Netanyahu said is just anti-Semitism, it's just a witch hunt, it's almost like blood libel, drawing upon all of the legitimate historical tropes, conspiracy theories that have been used against Jewish people, very legitimate, but using it to push forward their own ends, to consolidate their own power, and to continue their land grab in Palestine, and to keep murdering people with impunity. So what are some of the tricks? What are some of Israel's cute little tricks? One of its cute little tricks is that it justifies its occupation by saying that it isn't really occupying Palestine, because Palestine is not a state. So therefore, occupation law does not apply. But who's the one disallowing Palestine from becoming a state? The US and Israel primarily. So you see how that works? See what's going on there? Does that make sense? So of all the things, all the different measures that were put forward, it obviously signals that Resolution 2334, the one that condemned Israel's illegal settlements, it was not alone. At the same time, the UN Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia released a report, this is back in 2016, around that time, a report detailing Israel's apartheid regime as the prime barrier to Palestinian statehood. Ding ding. Does that make sense? Does this make sense in the context then of them wanting to deny Palestinian statehood? I think so. And this was shelved at the UN and never really discussed. It was just swept under the rug, like who cares? In the face of all of this, though, the Palestinian goal is simple. It's really simple. Freedom and statehood. And citing Franz Fanon, the great post-colonial scholar, Erakat the Brilliant exhibits a healthy skepticism of statehood, though. And this is a really interesting point, and it's one that Edward Said picks up on as well. Because it is, in a sense, to borrow from Audre Lorde, to use the master's tools against the master, where we have created a situation in which the only way for people to live free is if they live in a state, which is an oxymoron. You're not truly free if you're living in a state. But this is a situation that we've created for ourselves in the broader, global, ideological, powerhouse understanding of statehood and the necessity for statehood, because we've created it as a necessity. Because power has been collected into the hands of a few who have historically shown to be very willing to use it against people, leaving people's only recourse to adopt a state. Now, the problem with states is that they kind of freeze a people. They freeze them in time and they say, oh, well, here are your attributes, here is your language, here is your culture. It has been frozen in the form of the state, and it disallows people's natural propensity for change and flow and development. But this is what, Erakat the Brilliant is not saying that we can't do this. She's saying this is our only option, actually. But we have to be prepared to acknowledge the extent to which the solution is still part of the problem, and that to oppose colonial domination demands not only opposing colonizers, it means opposing the very logics that underwrite colonial domination, like statehood, like nationality, all of these things that work in a way to create distinctions and to permit the use of force against a perceived other that is not part of ourself being the colonizer, from whatever perspective that's coming from. So Erakat the Brilliant encourages us to not just settle for statehood, but to also think past statehood, to imagine what should come next. And we're seeing it. And this is something that, urban scholars or anthropologists are thinking about now, where the idea of states is growing more and more obsolete. We are really becoming more city-centered, which demands a rethinking of this thing called states. But when states have so much power, we need to rethink it. When states can murder now, within Palestine alone, more than 40,000 people, tens of thousands of children, who are, by definition, innocent. Tens of thousands of children. There's something wrong with this very structure. There's something fundamentally wrong with it that needs to be rethought. It needs to be challenged. It has to be brought down. There's no other way about it. And this isn't even mentioning the U.S.'s history of violence against people in the Middle East. Hundreds of thousands of dead civilians in Iraq, Afghanistan. It's unbelievable. And that puts us here into chapter 1, colonial erasures. So she starts here with the overview and then moves into the specific history from 1917 to 1967. So we're starting with a brief kind of spotlight checklist of all the things we'll cover, and then we're going to get into more detail in this history from 1917, so 30 years before Israel even existed, 30 years before then, all the way up to 67. So before World War II, Britain held colonial power over Palestine, what they called Mandate Palestine, over that region. And during this time, there was an influx and a steady increase and a steady movement of Jewish settlers from Europe and from other parts of the world into Palestine. This is before World War II. But there was nothing wrong with this. People were moving, and people move everywhere all the time. And as King Abdullah comes to say, these people weren't necessarily the problem, even if they had Zionist aspirations. He doesn't love it, because they went there believing that that land was theirs, with total disregard for the Palestinians who lived there at the time, and in many cases, the Jews who were living there at the time, who didn't share European Jews' culture, language, identity at all. So the issue was not necessarily them moving, even though there were a bunch of problems with that. It was really what would then happen after World War II, with the influx of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Jews from Europe into Palestine. But I don't mean to paint the pre-World War II period in Palestine as this rosy picture. Palestinians were under British occupation, which is obviously just, like, of course, Britain colonized most of the world. Like, and how they haven't been made to make reparations for most of this blows my mind. But maybe that's a conversation for another day, although it's totally relevant. Now, we talk about that now. Keep that right on the forefront of your minds. The other issue was that there were Zionist terrorist cells all throughout Palestine, intent on ridding the land of Palestinians to prime the world for the idea that this was a land without people, for, as the Zionist creed goes, a people without land, referring to European Jews. Now, in the face of Zionist violence, the British recognized that this was a problem, and the British were actually like, yeah, we're going to allow you to have self-governance here, because we see what's going on, and this is pretty messed up. And this is in the early 20th century. This is like 1917 into the 20s. The British were telling the Palestinians, we are going to give you the ability to self-govern because, we see that you're being victimized by Zionists here. And of course, the British backpedaled, and Palestinians then launched a series of strikes and riots in 1920, 1921, and 1929. Because their land was being steadily taken by Jewish settlers from Europe. And these Zionist settlers were not only victimizing Palestinians, they were actually going after the British as well, because the British, siding somewhat, I'm being very generous here, siding somewhat with the Palestinians, thought that Jewish settlements had to simmer down, they had to dial that back, because they were taking Palestinian land and victimizing Palestinians. And so the Zionist terrorist cells, obviously were going to then attack the British, as they did. There were repeated attacks on the British by Zionists, like who would eventually become an Israeli prime minister, Menachem Begin, who was a terrorist. The guy is recognized now as being a terrorist, who would then become, in the 70s, late 60s, leader of Israel. And that's allowed. It's interesting how some terrorists are allowed to become world leaders and some are branded as just terrorists. Now, all of this obviously intensified when Nazis took power, because Jewish immigration increased, and so did Palestinian resistance. And they held another general strike during World War II. And Jews were fleeing a horrible situation even before World War II. Anti-Semitism in Europe was horrendous, and it largely continues to be. No one's denying that. And if there are people denying that, I in no way affiliate with them at all. Because I think it's friggin' important to criticize, to challenge the veritable rise in anti-Semitism. The way that historical conspiracy theories are being used against Jews, somehow equating all Jews with Zionist expansion, with the Zionist project, to suggest that it's part of Judaism, that Israel is committing this slaughter against Palestinians, when it has nothing to do with Judaism at all. And these people need to be challenged. They absolutely do. But so does Israel. So in response to this influx of Jewish immigration during World War II, the Palestinians held a general strike called the Great Revolt between 1936 and 1939. So, sorry, not totally during World War II, that would have been 38, but the Nazis rise to power. And in response, the British launched an investigation and came up with what was called the Peel Report, for Lord Peel, who held power at the time, that called for partition. And the friggin' British, God, I normally swear a lot more in my life. I don't know, many of you probably don't know that. I swear a lot. So I'm just gonna go with friggin'. Friggin', the British love to do that. They love to partition things. They see a problem and they're like, oh, split it up into some states like they did with India and Pakistan. Just cleaving up states. They don't care, but they're just splitting people apart, creating conflict largely through their own occupation and colonization. And then they just wipe their hands of it. They say, oh, well, you now have your own states, figure it out. So the Peel Report prescribed essentially partition. But both Arabs and Jews in Palestine refused the suggestion because Palestinians wanted all the land that was theirs, like rightfully theirs, and Zionists wanted more than what the partition was asking for or was prescribing that they take. So Palestinians tried to use here Gandhi's nonviolent tactics to mount a kind of resistance to the British and to Zionist expansion. And this is a common theme throughout the Palestinian struggle, where armed resistance comprises the minority of cases of Palestinian resistance to Israel and to Britain. Armed resistance is a sliver. It's the tiniest fraction of all of the resistance that they've mounted. But you don't hear about that. You don't hear about that because it doesn't fit within the U.S.-Israel narrative in branding Palestinians as these blood-hungry terrorists intent on just murdering people, anyone that they see. So these revolts lasted until 1939. And in 1939, the British were under pressure to repress these revolts because they were intense. They were largely nonviolent, but they were intense. And in response, Britain published what it called its white paper in 1939, calling for an intense restriction of Jewish colonization in the region because they were siding somewhat with the Palestinians. Again, they were a colonizer. We aren't celebrating them here. But this should signal to you just the situation that Palestinians have been living under for a century, and really earlier than that too, living under for a century through or by Zionist rule and by Zionist expansion, to fly in the face of the idea that somehow, Palestinians just woke up on October 7th and decided to wreak havoc, like as though there is no history to this entire quote-unquote conflict. So this attests to the power of resistance, though. The Palestinians were successful at doing this, at limiting Jewish expansion in and on their territory. However, the repression that it elicited gave more power to terrorist Zionist groups like Irgun and Lehi, and ultimately to British powers, because the British, in response to Palestinian struggles and resistance between 1936 and 1939, at this time, the British began to increase their military presence there, and they branded it as this kind of permanent emergency, something that Israel would do as soon as it became a nation in 1948, and they would continue to do for about 20 years, until 1967 to justify committing violence against Palestinians and taking Palestinian land by continually screaming about how they are under threat. So they used this period, Israel used the history of Palestinian resistance as justification for their own increased security and heightened security and repression of Palestinians between 48 and 67, essentially continuing a legacy of British colonization. So where did this all begin, right? Where did this all begin? Well, it really began with British colonialism. The British can't be ignored here. Like, the British are so much responsible for this, it's unbelievable. But also, there's the Zionists. Specifically, Theodor Herzl's Zionist manifesto that got the Zionist ball rolling. Herzl believed, following the Dreyfus Affair, so the Dreyfus Affair was a horrendous display of anti-Semitism in which a French officer was accused of being a spy for Germany, and like, it was just blatant anti-Semitism that resulted in Dreyfus being essentially incarcerated. So Herzl believed, after witnessing the Dreyfus Affair, that Jews could not assimilate into European society. So he took on the task of homogenizing all Jews, saying they're just all the same, and they all have one dream, and that dream is to go to Palestine. And of course, that is to commit such a violence against Jews in Europe. Like, such a violence. And Hannah Arendt has written about this so much, to say that the Zionist dream has essentially victimized Jews. It victimized Jews first in reducing them to this one Zionist dream of returning to Palestine. Many Jews, when they actually had to go to Palestine because they were shipped out of there by the Nazis in their collaboration with Zionists in the early days of the Nazi Party, working with Zionists to concentrate Jews and deport many of them. When Jews within Palestine wanted to eventually return home, the Jewish agency there said nope, and actually harassed and assaulted Jews, tens of thousands of Jews trying to return. There's a big example of this in the case of Austrian Jews trying to return back to Austria. So this is like, we have to ask, how much of this is actually true about this so-called Jewish dream of Zionism, or to return to their perceived to be homeland? Is this something held by Jewish people, or is this something held by a select few Zionist Jews intent on realizing their own colonial aspirations? Now, in Herzl's words, Herzl believed that colonization was necessary to oppose what he called, quote-unquote, Asian barbarism. And this would be echoed a few years later, because Herzl was writing in the late 19th century. In 1917, under Lord Balfour's power, so we have what is called the Balfour Declaration, in which Balfour essentially called for Jewish settlement within Palestine, where, in his words, Zionism is of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of 700,000 Arabs. Which is to say, this is just colonization. It's just straight up colonization. That is all it is. It is to say, the people living there are less important than the people who want to be there. Now, Britain was largely in agreement with Herzl. Britain wanted to command that land for the trade purposes and to avoid French expansion. That is a crucial territory for trade for Europe in the West, and it has been for a long time. Its connection to the Suez Canal, which doesn't directly connect, obviously, doesn't directly connect with Palestine. It's more south of it. But it's still it's unbelievably important trade route, and historically has been for Europe and for the West. Now, this combat with the French, if you want more on this, you got to check out Edward Said's Orientalism, which I've covered here. A book I will probably at some point do again, because I've learned a lot more since doing it. And I understand now the urgency. And I understand now, which reflects very poorly on me, and something I'm very willing to acknowledge and say that I must atone for this. But in it, Said recounts the battle between the British and the French in their different forms of colonization of the Middle East, of the Arabic-speaking world, their different brands of Orientalism. Now, when the British took over, they essentially forced Palestinians to adopt their way of life in a lot of ways, adopt their language, adopt their university systems, to adopt everything else, which is a clever tactic. It's a very common tactic by colonial regimes. There are several cases in which Palestinians were trying to appeal to the British by saying, like, look, we have advanced degrees. Many of us are university educated, which flies in the face of the Zionist narrative that these people were uneducated or somehow couldn't work the land or somehow were non-existent. Many Palestinians trying to appeal to their colonizers because people are forced to, otherwise they die. That is the stakes here. Those are the stakes. You die if you do not adhere to the colonizer's way of life. Many were forced to be like, hey, we're really educated, we're really smart as per your own standards. And still the British were like, no, this is our territory now. And I should be a little bit more clear here about the timeline. So in 1920, Palestine belonged to the Syrian kingdom, which included Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. But the Treaty of Sèvres cleaved off Palestine for British and Jewish rule. Hence the Balfour Declaration in 1917, essentially priming this possibility. In 1923, the British released their Mandate for Palestine that viewed Palestine as the national home for the Jewish people. In 1923, before World War II, before Nazi Germany, they were taking over this land. In it, or in the British Mandate, they describe Palestinians only as non-Jewish. They don't even give them an identity. They just say, the people there, they're not Jewish, therefore they somehow are less deserving of this place. And then proceeded to systematically prevent Palestinian self-governance. Britain gave them scraps so long as they accepted the mandate. And there's so many resonances between this and the treatment of indigenous people in Canada and the United States. For a really great book on this, and that Erakat the Brilliant invokes, is Glenn Coulthard's Red Skin, White Masks, which I highly recommend. It's a play on Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, but looking at the colonial context in Canada, primarily, and his own ancestral heritage with the Dene people. The Dene people living primarily in what is now northern colonial Canada. And in this book, he looks at the various ways in which colonial regimes force colonized people to adopt their ways of life and to permit a certain amount of quote-unquote freedom to provide the veneer of having autonomy. So, for example, the Canadian government loves recognition. This is the entire core of Coulthard's book. They love recognition. They love to say, oh, Indigenous people, you can practice your own culture, you can practice your own identity, but you can't have real sovereignty. You can't have real control over the resources on your land. Water? Pfft, that's not yours. It's Canadian states. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about it. But we see this on full display in all colonial regimes in their treatment of colonized people. So a little bit more detail now, because we're moving through this in a little bit more detail. In 1936, as I mentioned before, Palestinians launched their Great Revolt in opposition to the British Mandate and Zionist colonization. In response, the British imposed martial law, which Israel would keep in place all the way till this day, essentially, under occupation. They arrested more people than they could. The British did. And they essentially limited Palestinian movement and killed with impunity and killed very often. It was just total martial law. It was just a total colonial police state. It is estimated that British forces killed 10% of adult men. 10%! What? It's unbelievable. Imagine if that happened in any other context. But in the case of Palestinians, nobody bats an eye. No one cares. Obviously, people care. The people there care. Noura Erakat cares. Obviously. But as far as the overall international community at the time, and for many decades, didn't care. And in response to the carnage, the 1939 White Paper sought to curtail Jewish immigration and the partition plan, to put in place the partition plan. In response, though, Zionist terrorists attacked the British and Palestinians, and in the end, the White Paper had little effect. Then comes the Holocaust, which is when we see the greatest influx of Jewish settlers from Europe into Palestine. Now, at this time, there were calls by many Western nations, including the U.S., for Jews to move to Palestine without opening their own doors for victimized Jews, of course. No. After World War II, the U.S. put extreme restrictions on Jewish immigration to the U.S. because of their own anti-Semitism, which no one likes to talk about, right? Because it's just Arabs are anti-Semitic. No one can mention how the U.S. denied Jews entry, instead shipping them to Palestine where it wouldn't be their problem. This is anti-Semitism on full display. The anti-Semitism that is at the core of the United States. So Israel would be born in 1948 with almost zero attention paid to its native people. Jews got a state, while Palestinians were thrown from their homes, thrown from their country, many of whom had to take refuge in Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, many of whom are still there now, or their descendants are still there in these diasporic communities now outside of historic Palestine. And at the time, just after World War II, or when Israel was formed in 1948, Jews comprised 30% of the population, but were given 55% of the land. a complete capture, a complete thievery of Palestinian land. And still, Zionists weren't happy. They wanted more. Of course they wanted more, and took up arms to get it. And so was born there's two different plans. It was the Gimel plan and the Dalet plan, or Dalet. With Ben-Gurion's help, David Ben-Gurion was the first prime minister of Israel, helped to assault Palestinians. As Noura Erakat writes, targets were to include clubs, cafes, meetings, assemblies, and the like, to target civilian places, to target civilians. This was their goal, and it was the goal of the Zionist terrorists before World War II in Mandate Palestine. They were murdering civilians, like the Deir Yassin massacre. There are so many examples of this, and you don't really hear about it very much. This isn't a history that is told very often. It's not part of the standard high school curriculum in the West. These terrorists would orchestrate the Deir Yassin massacre of 100 unarmed Palestinians. Then between 1947 and 1949, Zionist militia, and don't forget, Menachem Begin who led some of these terrorist groups, would become the leader of Israel in the late 60s, early 70s. Now, between 47 and 49, the Zionist militias and Israeli forces reduced the Arab population from 1 million to 160,000. This is what is referred to as the Nakba. The Nakba translates to the catastrophe, where in the period after World War II, when Israel was formed around 1948, approximately 800,000 Palestinians were cast from their homes and forced to flee, to go to Lebanon, to go to Syria, to go to Egypt, to go to Jordan. Have they been given the opportunity to return? Absolutely not. And the next decades, Israel would make sure, through its own use of legal force, to make sure that Palestinians can never return to their homes through various different legal tactics. This isn't even to mention all the people that the Zionists murdered. These are just people who they displaced from their homes, thrown into refugee camps. Now, by 1949, Israel had taken over 78% of the land in just a few years. In like 1 year. In 1 year. From 55% to 78% of the land, and had earned a spot in the UN, communicating approval, essentially having the UN communicate to the world its approval of Israel as a state, and therefore all of the actions and violence that Zionists had committed to achieve that state. But any kind of Palestinian resistance is branded as terrorist. It's illegitimate, right? In response to October 7th, Israel can kill 40,000 people, more. We have no idea what the actual number is. Tens of thousands of children can do that because of October 7th. But 100 years of colonization, Palestinians are not allowed any kind of resistance. If they do, 40,000 of them will die, maybe more. The remaining Palestinians, though, those who weren't cast from the land, the 160,000 remaining ones, were placed under lock and key and framed as an existential threat and racial threat to the Jewish state. So the remaining Palestinians were placed under military rule. Well, they were living under military rule, but that military rule was then continued now through Israel, not through the British. Now, in 1950, Israel, with European support, passed what was called the Absentees Property Law to provide legal justification to seize property once held by displaced Palestinians. So this is just saying they're never going to have the right to return. Israel was like, no, we're just going to take that land. And they would then use that to deny them re-entry, to say, oh, your land's not there anymore, so you have nowhere to go back to. So stay in Lebanon, so stay in Jordan, so stay in Egypt. You got nowhere to return to. In 1953, the land acquisition law allowed Israel to confiscate Palestinian land of those then living there, where people who were living there were then having their land seized in the early 50s. Between 1948 and 1953, 350 of 370 new Jewish settlements were on Palestinian land. So they, by this point, had taken over 78% of the land, at least by 1949. Then by 1953, they had set up 350 settlements on the remaining Palestinian land. Now, between 1948 and 1960, 3,000 to 5,000 Palestinians were murdered as they tried to return home. And the IDF would give out IDs to tell acceptable from unacceptable Palestinians. They were being branded, essentially, because we all know how that turned out in Nazi Germany. It's really haunting to see the resonances between the treatment of Jews under Nazi Germany and those treated, the way that Israel treats Palestinians. Very haunting to see the similarities, to ghettoize them, to render them refugees, to put them in essentially refugee concentration camps, to give them ID cards to be able to tell which ones are allowed there and which ones are not, to restrict their movement, to brand them all as a threat, to make them susceptible to just endless terror by this regime. But all that, still not enough. Of course it wasn't enough. And so was born the Law of Return in 1950 and Nationality Law in 1952, which these laws were the laws that say any single Jew on the planet has the right to that territory. Doesn't matter where you're from. Doesn't matter where you were born. Doesn't matter where your parents were born, your grandparents. Doesn't matter. Any Jew can go to that land and be welcomed in and be given land there. Native-born Palestinians, though, not so much. Absolutely denied any such possibility. And this was enshrined into law in the early 50s. And they would continue this legacy for decades. This is still very much on full display. A Jew born in New Jersey has more of a right to that land than a Palestinian born there today. And they continue this for decades, right? Treating Arabs in the region as second-class citizens at best and threats to be killed off at worst. As Hannah Arendt wrote, writing about the Eichmann trial, when she was in Jerusalem, this is what Hannah Arendt, the most famous writer on totalitarianism and fascism, had to write. She wrote, "They treat the Arabs in a way that in itself would be enough to rally the whole world against Israel." Very interesting observation from the world's leading expert on totalitarianism at the time. And yeah, that is going to put us then into Chapter 2, which we'll cover along with Chapter 3 next time. And this is going to focus, Chapter 2 is going to focus on the period from 1967 to 1973. But yeah, I hope that this was informative. I hope that you're able to continue along. I think it's really important. And I think that Erakat the Brilliant provides just an amazing overview here. And we haven't even begun to scratch the surface. We're going to get into so much more of this. I hope that I'm able to keep you here. And yeah, on that note, if there's anything I got wrong or anything I excluded, I'd love to hear about it. You can leave it in the comments. If you like what I did, you can share, getting this word out. For any time you share me, though, make sure you share 25 Palestinians. It's so important to amplify Palestinians right now. And yeah, on that note, take care.